Everyone, so welcome back. Now we are gonna take a deep dive and look at cost, volume, profit relationships. All right, so that sounds like a whole lot of mouthful, but let's go through it and see what this means. All right, so what exactly does that mean? So in a nutshell, it says it examines the relationship among the selling price, sales and production, volume, cost, expenses, and profit. So maybe you're like, girl, you didn't even help us out at all. What was that? All right. So in plain English, right? Here it is. So we're examining what happens to your profit, especially if you're a manufacturing business or what have you. What happens to your profit if you increase or decrease your price, right? And so while it may seem like the answer to that question is a surefire of, oh, I'm going to lose money, but how much money, or how will this affect my business overall? Will I be able to cover my fixed costs, which we'll get into in the latter part of this chapter. Also, we're looking at what happens to your profit if materials start to increase or decrease. Again, we're a manufacturing business, and sometimes we need raw materials, right? And so in our prior examples, we were looking at manufacturing speakers. So what happens if the price of buying the materials to make speakers start to increase? How does that affect our bottom line, our profit? What happens if you produce more product, right? What does that look like? How does that affect your profit? How does it affect storage and insurance and all of that good stuff? We also examined how do you set a sales price. It also helps you to determine what is the product mix to sell. Meaning if you have two different products, how should you market, or how should you look at placing one product over another? How do you do the marketing campaigns for that? And then lastly, it helps you determine what's your marketing strategy, or what should your marketing strategy be. All right, so let's first start off in this section about cost, volume, profit analysis. Let's look at first contribution margin, okay? So contribution margin is, the formula for contribution margin is sales less variable cost equals contribution margin. Now, my next point states that contribution margin must cover fixed costs in order for the company to turn a profit. So as you can recall from the prior videos or early on in this chapter, fixed cost represents any of those costs that are in essence fixed. So those could be salary, it could be property taxes, right? It could be a number of things. It could be depreciation, right? So fixed cost equals, again, salaries, property taxes, depreciation, things of that nature, right? So we must generate enough sales to make sure we cover our fixed cost to get a profit. So here's our example. It says, given this information here, right, what is our contribution margin? Right, so our sales is 50,000 units. The selling price per unit is $20 per unit. Variable cost per unit is 12, and our fixed cost is $30,000. So our first question, sales margin. All right, so the way we're going to figure this out, our formula again is sales less our variable cost equals our contribution margin. Now think back to accounting 1A. Remember, the way we go about figuring out our sales amount is we're going to do the selling price per unit, which is $20 per unit, times the amount of units that we sold, which is 50,000, right? And to calculate our variable cost, remembering that variable cost varies with the number of units that we sell, our variable cost per unit is $12 per unit times the number of units that we sold, which is 50,000 units. So once we do this calculation, right? So this 20 times the 50,000 units that we sold equals $1 million, less our variable cost, which is $12 per unit times the 50,000 units that we sold, that equals $600,000, excuse me. So our contribution margin equals $600,000. Excuse me, that is wrong. Don't listen to that. Our contribution margin is actually correction $400,000. Okay. So what we're saying is that there must be enough of this, enough contribution margin to cover our fixed costs in order for our business to generate a profit. Now, our next question is, what is the income from operation? Well, once we satisfy our variable costs, then we have our fixed costs. So if I'm setting up my formula or income statement, it's going to be this: sales less my variable cost equals contribution margin less my fixed cost is going to equal my income from operation. Okay. So right now where we are, we figured out what our contribution margin is, which is the 400,000, and then it tells us that our fixed cost is 300,000. So therefore, our income from operation equals $100,000 in profit. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. All right. So of course I did it the long way. There is all this part in the book, so I'm just going to erase all of this so you can see it a little bit better. And this is how we're coming up with our income from operations. Okay. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to contribution margin ratio. So as a reminder, a ratio is just like a odds of something, right? So if I said there's a 2-to-1 ratio, right, or a 1-to-1 ratio, it's just a division, right? Or you're looking at the odds of something. So maybe that's not a good explanation, but you'll see in just a second exactly what I mean when we're looking at the contribution margin ratio. All right, so contribution margin ratio indicates the percentage of each sales dollar available to cover fixed costs and provide income from operation. So don't forget, your contribution margin ratio is a percentage. Okay, and so our formula to figure out our contribution margin ratio is contribution margin divided by sales. Okay. All right. So given this information similar to the prior slide, what is our contribution margin ratio? So pause it right here, maybe take a second and see if you can figure out what our contribution margin ratio is. All right, so hopefully you did that pause, but the way we go about figuring this out is we're going to do contribution margin ratio equals our contribution margin, which we figured out already was 400,000, divided by our sales, which is $1 million, right? So for us, our contribution margin ratio should be 40%. 40% represents the percentage that's going to be dedicated. All right, so that's how we get to the 40%, okay? So contribution margin ratio, so what? Why is it a big deal? Who cares, right? So let's talk about it. So it's useful when there's an increase or decrease in the sales volume when it's measured in dollars. So you're basically trying to capture, hey, what happens if my sales volume decrease? How will that affect me? How would that affect my bottom line without actually going through that scenario, right? So as a business owner, you want to project as much as you can, and you want to be prepared for as many scenarios as you can. And so that's what contribution margin ratio allows you to do. It allows you to give or provide all of these different types of what if scenarios so that you can brace yourself in the event that this does occur, okay? It also captured changes from income. So let's do this what if scenario. For example, if Lambert adds $80,000 in sales from the sale of an additional 4,000 units, its income from operation will increase by $32,000. So what we're saying is, without going through this scenario, because we have this formula, we can quickly calculate that, hey, in a perfect scenario, all other things being equal, if I just sell an additional 4,000 units, this could have a potential positive effect of $32,000 to my income from operation. And the way we're doing this is we're looking at the change in sales dollars times our contribution margin ratio, right? And so the way we're going about it is, if you're looking at my screen, the formula is you're looking at the $80,000 that you add in sales, right? And then you are also taking into account your contribution margin ratio that you already calculated, and then that's how you get to your 32,000. Now, if you're more of a visual person like I am, you can also work through this scenario, right? So what you see here, this was our original, this was our original scenario at the very top. And now we're saying if we add 4,000 more units, which this is representing an additional 4,000 units, how will this affect all of our other numbers? Remembering that fixed costs never change, right? So whether we sell 50,000 units, 60,000 units, our fixed costs will relatively remain the same. Okay. All right, so with that, I'm going to take a break and we're going to go and do this breakout session, okay?